Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before.
I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey lurkers, welcome to episode 29. Today, as I promised back in the Baltimore Haunted Bars episode, which was episode 27, I'm going to be talking about famous author Edgar Allan Poe. Poe was my personal introduction to creepy writing, and I've loved his poems and short stories most of my life. Edgar Allan Poe led a pretty tragic life, though perhaps that isn't too hard to believe if you're familiar with anything he's ever written. Edgar was born in Boston, Massachusetts on January 9th, 1809. His parents were Elizabeth Arnold Hopkins Poe and David Poe Jr. Both were traveling actors. He was the second child with an older brother named William Henry Leonard Poe and a younger sister named Rosalie Poe. Poe's father abandoned the family in 1810, leaving his mother to care for and support 3 small children. She died from consumption, which is what we call tuberculosis today, in 1811 in Richmond, Virginia, when Poe was around the age of 3. He never really knew either of his parents. The 3 Poe children were split up after their mother's death. Edgar was taken by John Allan, who some claim was his godfather, and Allan's wife Frances, who was childless. She was unable to have any children. John Allan was a successful merchant in Richmond, Virginia. The Allans never legally adopted Edgar, but they gave him the name Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I've seen a couple different things. There were some indication that Poe is the one who made sure his name was Edgar Allan Poe, rather than Edgar Poe Allan. John Allan went between 2 different extremes while he parented Edgar, spoiling him one moment and then severely disciplining him the next. Edgar seemed to have had a strong bond with his foster mother, Frances, but he had a difficult relationship with his foster father, John Allan. Between 1815 and 1820, the Allans took Edgar to Scotland, where he received a classical education that was continued once they returned to Virginia. Scotland is where John Allan was from. By the time he was 13, Edgar was already a prolific poet, but his talents were discouraged by his headmaster and by John Allan. Allan wanted Edgar to follow in his footsteps and join the family business. Supposedly, Edgar wrote poems on the back of John Allan's business papers. I find this rather amusing and slightly vengeful on the part of Edgar, and that just makes me like him even more. In 1824, Edgar served as the lieutenant of the Richmond Youth Honor Guard as the city celebrated the visit of the Marquis de Lafayette. This is, of course, the Lafayette that helped us beat the British during the Revolutionary War. Lafayette and the color guard stopped at Richmond's old stone house to visit the Agee family, who assisted in the American Revolution. Poe stood guard on the front steps of the house. Edgar became engaged to Sarah Elmira Royston before heading to university in 1826. She, at that point, promises to wait until after his graduation to marry. Poe attended the University of Virginia, where he began studies in ancient and modern languages and excelled academically. However, John Allan did not give him enough money to pay for tuition. Some information indicates that John Allan only gave him about 1/3 of what Poe actually needed. To try to come up with the money he needed, Edgar turned to gambling. But in order to earn money gambling, you kind of need to be good at it, and Poe was not good at gambling. John Allan did send more money and clothes, but Poe's debts continued to increase. Poe dropped out after a year. He had built up $2,000 worth of gambling debt, which is equivalent to $55,416.16 in today's world. Upon returning home, Edgar discovered that his sweetheart, Elmira, had married another man named Alexander Shelton. Apparently, Elmira's father had intercepted Poe's letters and steered his daughter in the direction of another man who promised to be a successful businessman, something Edgar was not. That, coupled with not feeling welcome at home, Poe traveled to Boston in April of 1827, where he managed to sustain himself with odd jobs as a clerk and newspaper writer. Poe began using the pseudonym Henri Le Rennet during this time. Because he was unable to support himself, Edgar ended up enlisting in the army as a private May 27th of 1827, under the name Edgar A. Perry, and he also claimed that he was 22 years old even though he was only 18. During his first year in the army, he released his first book, which was a 40-page collection of poems. Only 50 copies were printed, and it received basically no attention. November of 1827, Poe's regiment was stationed in Charleston, South Carolina, and Poe was promoted to, I don't know how to pronounce this word, artificer or artificer? I don't know. Pick one. Which basically is an enlisted tradesman who prepared shells for the artillery. By the end of his 2 years in the army, Poe reached the rank of sergeant major for artillery, which was the highest rank that a non-commissioned officer could achieve. He sought to end his 5-year enlistment early. He revealed his true name and circumstances. You'll remember he enlisted under a phony name and he lied about his age to his commanding officer. His commanding officer would only allow Poe to be discharged if he reconciled with Allan. So Poe wrote a letter to John Allan, who was unsympathetic towards Poe and basically ignored his pleas. It's possible John Allan didn't even write to Poe to let him know his foster mother was ill. Frances Allan died February 1829, and Poe did not make it home until the day after her burial. Finally, perhaps softened by the death of his wife, John Allan agreed to support Poe's attempt to be discharged in order to receive an appointment to West Point Military Academy in New York. Poe was discharged April 1829 after finding a replacement to finish his enlisted term for him. Before entering West Point, he moved back to Baltimore for a bit and stayed with his Aunt Maria Clem and her daughter, who is Poe's first cousin, Virginia Eliza Clem, his brother Henry, and his grandmother Elizabeth Poe. He lived in Baltimore for about 4 years. September of that year, he received some encouraging words about his poetry by critic John Neal, and Poe released his second book of poetry. July 1st, 1830, Poe enters West Point as a cadet. October 1830, John Allan marries his second wife. The marriage, plus fierce fights between John Allan and Poe regarding illegitimate children that John Allan fathered from affairs he had while he was married to Frances, resulted in John Allan finally disowning Edgar. Basically, Edgar was really ticked that his foster father cheated on his foster mother, because he had a very close bond with his foster mother. Not so much with John Allan. Poe was not happy to find out that there were illegitimate children, which meant he cheated on her. In fact, I believe when John Allan died, Poe actually did not inherit anything the illegitimate children inherited. Edgar then decided to leave West Point, which he managed to do by being court-martialed for negligence of duty and disobedience of orders for refusing to attend formations, classes, or church. He left for New York in February of 1831 and released a third volume of poetry. He returned to Baltimore to live with his aunt, cousin, and brother in March of 1831. His brother Henry was in poor health, mainly due to alcoholism, and he died August 1st of 1831. Poe began to seriously get his writing career started after his brother's death, and Poe is actually one of the first Americans to be able to live solely off his writing. He was not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but he was able to basically work as a writer and make enough money to get by. At this point, Poe starts writing short stories and has a couple published in periodicals. He becomes assistant editor of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond in April of 1835, but he ended up getting fired after a few weeks for being drunk on the job. He ends up returning to Baltimore and gets a license to marry his cousin Virginia. That's right, his first cousin Virginia. And at the time, she was only 13, and Poe was 26. I'm not really going to pass any judgment here. It's hard to take 2021 standards and apply them to 1835. It was not typical during this time frame for this age difference. It's still a little unusual, but we're not even going to go there. Honestly, my great-great-grandfather was like 50-something, and his second wife was 16 when they got married, so trust me, it happens. He gets this marriage license. It's not certain if they actually got married at that point in time. He had the license, but they don't know if he actually got married then. Poe often referred to Virginia as Sissy, which is a term for sister, and his Aunt Maria as Muddy, which was kind of a term of endearment for a mother. So there are some who presume that the relationship between Virginia and Edgar was actually more familial than romantic, but honestly, we're never really going to know. He did love her dearly. That is something that is certain, and it's said that his aunt and his wife, or his cousin, whichever one you want to call her by, that they actually had a very calming and settling effect on Edgar overall. That when he was with them, he seemed to be more grounded. Poe is then reinstated as assistant editor after promising to be on his best behavior, and he goes back to Richmond with Virginia and her mother, who is Edgar's Aunt Maria Clem, and he stays at the Messenger until January of 1837. Poe publishes several poems, book reviews, critiques, and stories. May 16, 1836, Poe and Virginia had a wedding ceremony at their Richmond boarding house, with a witness falsely stating Virginia's age was 21. She wasn't. Summer of 1839, Poe becomes assistant editor of another literary magazine. 1940, 100 years later. 1840, he announces his plan to start his own literary magazine, but it's never actually accomplished before his death. Poe found another position at another magazine as a writer and co-editor. The magazine saw great success during Poe's tenure. At the time, Poe attempts to get a position in the administration of President John Tyler, claiming that he was a member of the Whig Party, and he hoped to be appointed to the United States Custom House in Philadelphia, with the help from President Tyler's son Robert, who was basically a friend of Poe's. January 1842, Virginia shows the first signs of consumption, which again is tuberculosis. She was playing the piano and singing when she had a hemorrhage and began spitting up blood. Poe began to drink heavily due to the stress of her illness. He doesn't show up for a meeting regarding the job in the president's administration, claiming he was sick, though most thought he was drunk. He was promised an appointment, but all the positions were filled by others. He moves around to different jobs at a couple of magazines before becoming editor of the Broadway Journal and eventually its owner. Poe then alienates himself from his fellow writers by publicly accusing Henry Wadsworth Longfellow of plagiarism. Longfellow never responded. January 1845, the poem The Raven appears in the Evening Mirror and becomes a popular sensation. He was only paid $9 for the poem. Can you imagine? Think about how popular that is today. Honestly, the NFL football team in Baltimore, they're called the Ravens, and they're named after this poem. That's how popular this poem is and how popular Poe is. Also, a quick point, one of the things Poe said about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was the fact that, well, he's popular now, but he's not going to be popular down the road. And honestly, can you name one poem that was written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow? I can list one poem, which is it's Paul Revere's Ride. I don't even know the actual title. I always know The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. And it's basically, I think I remember some of the lines. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. That's all I remember, because I'm a nerd. Anyway, most people can't even remember a poem by Longfellow, but if you think about Edgar Allan Poe, most people are familiar with at least one of his writings, and oftentimes it's The Raven that they're familiar with. Anyway, getting back on track, the summer of 1839, Poe becomes... Oh, wait. Let's try that again. Let me see if I can get my ass back on track. The Broadway Journal failed in 1846, and Poe moves to New York in an area that is now known as the Bronx. His wife, Virginia, died at the cottage January 30th, 1847. Poe showed up at her burial in a cloak that actually was the blanket his wife was wrapped in at the time of her death. and he was also known to go to her grave at night and sit there, where people would then find him nearly frozen to death in the morning. I mean, he really fell apart because of her death. Poe becomes increasingly unstable after his wife's death. He attempted to court poet Sarah Helen Whitman, who lived in Providence, Rhode Island. Their engagement failed, allegedly because of Poe's drinking and erratic behavior. There's also speculation that Whitman's mother intervened and worked hard to derail their relationship. Poe returned to Richmond, where he struck up a romance with his childhood sweetheart, Elmira Roster, who now goes by Shelton, who was a wealthy widow at this point in time. They reportedly became engaged in 1849, much to the dismay of her children. Poe planned to move permanently to Richmond to be with Elmira. He planned a trip to New York to bring his aunt, and who's also his mother-in-law, back to Richmond. He was also planning to see a client in Philadelphia along the way. September 26, 1849, Poe leaves Richmond. Elmira was concerned about his health. He had had a bout of cholera, and his health was supposedly fragile. She encouraged Poe to see his doctor, which he did, but it was mostly a social visit since his doctor was also a friend. September 27th, Poe boards a ship headed to Baltimore. There is no account of Poe's whereabouts between September 27th and October 3rd, 1849. October 3rd was Election Day in Baltimore in 1849. It was raining. That's a good song, by the way, Raining in Baltimore by the Counting Crows. On that day, October 3rd, Poe was found delirious on the street outside a bar called Gunner's Hall in Baltimore. The bar also served as a pop-up polling place for the Fourth Ward of Baltimore. It no longer exists. A gentleman by the name of Joseph Walker was heading out to the polls when he came across a man, delirious and dressed in shabby second-hand clothes, lying in the gutter. The man was semi-conscious and unable to move. Joseph Walker recognized the man as Edgar Allan Poe and asked him the name of his closest acquaintances in Baltimore that might be able to help him. Poe gave him the name of Joseph Snodgrass, a magazine editor who also had some medical training. Walker sent Snodgrass a message asking for help. Baltimore City, October 3rd, 1849. Dear Sir, there is a gentleman, rather worse for wear, at Ryan's Fourth Ward polls, who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe, and who appears to be in great distress, and he says he is acquainted with you. He is in need of immediate assistance. Yours, in haste, Joseph W. Walker to J. E. Snodgrass. This was the first anyone had heard or seen of Poe since he left Richmond. It was determined that Poe was not dressed in his own clothing. He was always known to be sharply dressed, but the clothes he was found in were old, dirty, and stained. The shoes were worn at the heel, and he was wearing a beat-up straw hat. Because of the location where he was found, outside a bar, it was assumed Poe was drunk, and he was taken to Washington Medical College, which I don't think exists anymore. Poe was at the college hospital for 4 days. He was never coherent long enough to explain what had happened. He drifted between fits of delirium and visual hallucinations. He was said to have repeatedly called out the name Reynolds the night before he died. There was a Judge Reynolds who was on the ballot at the polling place, which was also the bar where he was found. Edgar Allan Poe died October 7th, 1849. Some sources said that Poe's last words were, "Lord help my poor soul." Newspapers reported his death as congestion of the brain or cerebral inflammation, both of which were common terms used for death from disreputable causes like alcoholism. All documentation of Poe's death was lost in a fire, in a flood, who knows, but it's lost. That's something that genealogists hate hearing the most, since that information is then forever lost. But Poe's death leaves a lot of questions and several different theories about what really happened. Some of the theories include being beaten, possibly in a robbery. Alcoholism is also on the list. It was documented that after just one glass of wine, Poe would become staggering drunk, something his sister also dealt with, and it was thought to be hereditary. But Poe was a vocal member of the temperance movement and avoided drinking because he knew of the issue. Despite many of his close friends blaming his death on alcohol, testing of Poe's hair indicate that he was faithful to his vow of sobriety. So alcoholism is really not on the table. Carbon monoxide poisoning is on the list, possibly from coal gas used for indoor lighting. This theory is largely discounted. Heavy metal poisoning was thought to be a possibility. He had high levels of mercury based on the test of his hair. He was prescribed mercury chloride during the bout of cholera. Mercury poisoning would explain his hallucinations and delirium, but the levels found were still 30 times below the level consistent with mercury poisoning. Rabies was another theory that came about when doctors who were part of a clinical pathologic conference were given anonymous patients with a list of their symptoms, and they were supposed to diagnose them. One doctor received Edgar Allan Poe as a patient. Now, it was an anonymous thing. They did not know who the patients were. They were just given the symptoms. So this doctor that got Poe, he actually listed his diagnosis as rabies, which followed basically every symptom that Poe had, except people who have rabies tend to not. Rabies is also called hydrophobia. They don't drink water. They have an aversion to water. It's kind of odd. Poe actually was seen drinking water within a day or two, supposedly, of being found. So that kind of throws out the idea of rabies. That was always my favorite one. Possible brain tumor is also on the list. When Poe died, he was actually buried in an unmarked grave in a Baltimore graveyard. 26 years after, a statue was erected honoring Poe near the graveyard's entrance. Poe's coffin was dug up and moved to a new, more honorable location. The coffin fell apart as it was being moved, and one of the workers remarked on a strange feature of Poe's skull. He said that there was something rolling around inside. Of course, they assumed at the time that it was Poe's brain, that it had shriveled up and turned into a hard mass during decomposition. But we know now that it couldn't have been his brain because brains are the first organ to decompose. However, brain tumors can calcify after death and turn into hardened masses. Interestingly, Poe was once told he had a lesion on his brain, and that's what caused his reaction to alcohol. So brain tumor's pretty up there on my possible theories. That's one that I actually think is a possibility. Another theory is called cooping, and this is the best theory in my opinion. Cooping was a method of voter fraud. What would happen is that a victim was kidnapped, disguised, and forced to vote for a specific candidate multiple times under multiple disguises. Victims were usually given alcohol and allegedly kept in small containers similar to chicken coops, hence the term. This would explain the odd clothing and his overall condition, plus his mentioning of the name Reynolds, which was allegedly the name of someone on the ballot, could also point to that theory. What's most interesting about Poe's death is that with his death, Poe leaves us with probably one of the biggest mysteries. It's still, in the year 2021, we don't have a clue what killed him. We're never going to know what killed him. So the man who basically invented detective novels left us with one of the biggest mysteries. So Rufus Griswold, who was Poe's literary rival, wrote an obituary for Poe that said, "Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it." Griswold also wrote Poe's biography, wherein he attempted to completely trash Poe as a person and a writer. Did you know who Griswold was? And I don't mean from the National Lampoon movies. Did you know who Poe was? Guess Poe has the upper hand here. It was actually found out that Griswold forged some of the items that he was using as proof as to Poe's character and writing ability. Poe was a pioneer. He was one of the first American authors to become more popular in Europe than America. He basically invented the detective story, and he was also a forerunner of sci-fi. He influenced writers like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and H.P. Lovecraft. No childhood home of Poe's is actually still in existence. The old stone house in Richmond is used as the Edgar Allan Poe Museum, and this was the house that Poe visited with Lafayette while he served in the Color Guard, but he never actually lived there. The earliest surviving home where Poe lived is in Baltimore and is the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum. This is where he lived with his aunt, cousin, who later became his wife, brother, and grandmother. One of the homes that Poe lived in Philadelphia survived and is operated by the National Park Service as the Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site. His final home in the Bronx is preserved as the Edgar Allan Poe Cottage. And now, after all that background about the sad, tragic life of one of America's greatest writers, we're going to get into the paranormal end of things. Because how could someone like Poe, who wrote such macabre fiction, not be haunting something? Let me tell you, this man haunts everything. Several states. I'm not really sure how somebody can haunt several different states at the same time. As I was researching, and I'm like, okay, well, it's these states that I have to look at, then I would find, no, crap, here we are, it's this state too. Oh, wait, I forgot about this state. So there are several places that he is actually seen now that he's dead. We're going to start with the Old Stone House in Richmond, which is the home of the Edgar Allan Poe Museum. It was built in 1754 as a private residence. Poe never lived here, but it's located only blocks away from his Richmond home. This location is said to be haunted by 3 different spirits. 2 of the ghosts are children with blonde hair and are thought to be members of the Egg family who lived in the home. These 2 ghosts like to show up in the background of photos tourists take in the building. The 3rd ghost is a shadow figure that walks the halls. You'll remember from episode 18, Shadow People, that in some cases these entities can be classified as ghosts. In this instance, this shadow person falls under that category. The identity of this spirit isn't proven, but it's thought that this is the ghost of Edgar Allan Poe. He seems to be particularly connected to a hand mirror that belonged to his wife Virginia, and a walking stick he left in Richmond when he left for New York, and ultimately ended up dying in Baltimore. This black shadow man also shows up in photographs and videos. In one photograph, he's captured standing behind a tour group, as though he's listening to what the guide has to say. But this ghost is more likely to interact with items in the house. He's also seen walking in the courtyard and behind the house. There's one pretty incredible story associated with the building. They had received a delivery of a box of small Edgar Allan Poe bobbleheads. They didn't have the chance to unpack it prior to leaving and going home. So they left the unopened box there in the museum, and they planned on unpacking it when they returned in the morning. But when they returned to the museum in the morning, they found all the small bobbleheads had been taken out of the box and placed on a gift shop shelf. That wasn't even the weirdest thing. The strangest thing is they have motion sensor alarms in the building. None of those motion sensor alarms were triggered. Next, we're going to head to Baltimore, where there are numerous sightings of Poe's ghost. Back in episode 26, Haunted Baltimore Bars, we talked about a couple of the ghost stories associated with Poe. One of the stories centers around the Fells Point bar called The Horse You Came In On. In the Baltimore episode, I kept calling it The Horse You Rode In On. That's not the name of it. It's The Horse You Came In On. This bar was said to be the last stop before Poe was found delirious in the street and later died. There's a ghost that frequents the upstairs rooms of the building that the employees affectionately call Edgar. Footsteps are heard walking along the 2nd and 3rd floor and the stairs in between. The chandelier moves, sometimes rather violently, though there's no explanation as to why. The cash register drawer opens on its own too. Whenever someone makes a statement about ghosts being fake, the person's bar stool is pulled out from under them, or their drink slides off the table. There's a designated spot at the bar for Edgar's ghost, and the bartender leaves a glass of cognac, which is said to be Poe's preferred drink, at the seat. Inexplicably, liquid goes missing from the glass, though no one touches it. I just recently saw a little blurb in a book. It's called Ghost Hunting Maryland by Michael J. Varhola and Michael H. Varhola. In there, in the story about Poe, it actually says that they leave the glass of cognac at the seat when they close up, and when they come back the next day, the glass has been picked up, emptied, cleaned, and put back. I didn't see that anywhere else, but I thought I would include that here. Many people have seen Poe's ghost walking down the street headed towards the bar. So he's seen not only in the bar, but walking in that general direction. Not far from the Horse You Came In On saloon is the house Poe lived in while he was in Baltimore. Poe lived in the brick townhouse for a couple of years with his aunt, cousin, brother, and grandmother. In the 1930s, Baltimore had plans to demolish the house, but thankfully the Edgar Allan Poe Society managed to purchase the property and opened it to the public in 1949. Exhibits in the house include a lock of Poe's hair, china that once belonged to John Allan, a reproduction of the portrait Poe painted of his wife after she died, a reprint of the 1849 obituary, Poe's original announcement about creating his own literary magazine that never got started. There are a few strange phenomena that people have reported here. Some have felt the sensation of someone tapping them on the shoulder. That would really irritate my mother. Don't tap her on the shoulder. Some have heard mysterious voices. Lights have moved around in the house when no one is in it, and there are unexplainable cold spots. Windows have flown open and slammed shut on their own, and in one instance a window fell out of its frame and smashed onto the floor. They hear thumps and footsteps throughout the house too. Some have claimed they have even seen Poe's ghost in the house. But what most people see or sense at this location is the apparition of a woman described as heavyset and middle-aged. Who she is or how she's connected to Poe are unclear. She does not seem to be an angry spirit, and she doesn't spook anyone. Most believe her to be a residual haunting. And a residual haunting, if you'll remember from the times before that we've talked about it, is basically kind of like a film strip. It's like an energy imprint. So when you see it, it's not seeing you, you're just seeing it replaying something that it used to do. Local street gangs in the area where the Poe house is located say they do not consider the old house part of their territory because it's protected by a lone raven and the ghost of Mr. Eddie, which is how they refer to Edgar Allan Poe. The curator of the Poe house says they've never been robbed, he's never been bothered, and the tourists have never been bothered either. Many of the area kids are afraid to come in and swear there are things in the basement. One gang member said that there are a few things around the Poe house he fears. Neither of those are guns or the streets. He insists the house is haunted. During the riots that broke out in Baltimore after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April 1968, neighbors ended up calling the police to say that even though the power was out, lights were flickering in the Poe house. The police went to investigate and saw the lights themselves, but short of breaking in, they couldn't enter, so they waited until the next day to do a thorough check, and no one had been in the house. When Poe died, he was first buried in an unmarked grave in the old Western burial grounds in Baltimore. In 1875, his body was moved after a group of schoolchildren raised money for a monument placed in his honor. It was called Pennies for Poe. Eventually, the Westminster Presbyterian Church, now Westminster Hall, was built over a portion of the graveyard, making that area catacombs. And I've been to this particular cemetery. It's really creepy. Poe's presence has been seen and felt at his grave, and it's shown up in photos, and there are some who claim that his body isn't in the current grave. Not surprising, the graveyard is not only haunted, but was also the scene for a mysterious visitor known as the Poe Toaster. Every year between 1949 and 2009, on January 19th, which is Poe's birthday, a mysterious admirer of Poe's visited his grave, raised a glass of cognac, then left the bottle and 3 red roses on the grave. The toaster showed up between midnight and 6 a.m., dressed all in black with a white scarf and a big hat. No one really knows the reason for the cognac. Contrary to popular belief, there is no mention of that being Poe's drink of choice. More than likely, cognac was the toaster's preferred drink. Poe enthusiasts believe the red roses represent Poe, his wife Virginia, and his Aunt Maria. No one ever tried to unmask the visitor, as he was watched by a small group of people each year. Eventually, a note was left saying the torch was passed in 1999, but it never was the same after that, and eventually stopped altogether in 2009. Many have actually seen Poe himself walking around the graveyard and even standing at the altar inside the church. But Poe's ghost isn't the only one in the graveyard. I know this is about Poe and Poe haunting things, but this cemetery has a couple of interesting stories with it, so I'm going to share those as well. The skull of Cambridge is buried in this cemetery. It's reported to be the decapitated head of a murdered minister. It's believed the skull is now buried encased in cement in order to block out its screaming. At one time, the skull would scream at all hours of the day and night, and was so terrible sounding that it lingered in the minds of those who were subjected to it for a prolonged period of time, often driving them to insanity and commitment in a psych ward. The catacombs under the church were often victim of grave robbers. The School of Medicine was nearby, and medical students needed bodies to dissect. 2 grave robbers, who were also medical students, were caught in the act of robbing a grave, and a mob formed, resulting in one of the students being hung from a nearby street lamp. His ghost now wanders around the property. It's also believed that some of those interred in the cemetery were buried alive during a time where it wasn't unusual for that kind of mistake to be made. In fact, back then, they had bells that were above the ground, and they were attached to a string that went down into the coffin. And if somebody had been buried alive and they moved around, they would pull the string and it would ring the bell, alerting, hopefully, someone who might be around that, hey, there's a not dead person under here. It's a real thing. But it wasn't unusual for that to happen, and because of that, there are spirits who haunt the graveyard seeking revenge on the people who killed them by burying them alive. After World War I, most of the congregation chose to worship elsewhere, and the local children began playing in the cemetery. One minister reported seeing children running around with unearthed skulls on broomsticks. I would never do that. I had the pleasure of visiting this former church and graveyard many years ago when I was in middle school with the members of my church's confirmation class. I've always wanted to go back there as an adult. It is creepy. They do offer tours, not many, in their small groups, but it is definitely a must-see destination if you're into ghosts, paranormal, or Edgar Allan Poe. I do recommend going there. I've also been to the Poe house, and that's also another really cool place to visit. We're not done with Poe hauntings yet, because now we're going to jump to South Carolina. While he was in the Army, Poe was stationed in South Carolina near Sullivan Island, and this is where he wrote the short story The Gold Bug. Some say that Poe's ghost is still there walking the beach of Sullivan's Island, and that he also haunts a few of Charleston's pubs. In a private community called Wild Dunes Resort, there's a large live oak on the 13th hole of the golf course. It's thought to be the same tree that inspired the gold bug tree from the story, and people have seen the ghost of Poe sitting beneath it with a pen and paper feverishly writing. In December 1843, Poe traveled to Newark, Delaware to lecture at the Newark Academy, and he spent the night at a nearby St. Patrick's Inn. According to legend, upon returning to the inn, Poe tripped while exiting his carriage and fell in the mud. It's said that he yelled, "A curse upon this place! All who enter shall have to return." He came back again and spent another week there in 1849 before his death, and he was there lecturing about poetry. Over the years, the original structure was removed, either intentionally or due to fire. The new structure was built in 1851 and called the Deer Park Tavern, and it was built on the site of the original St. Patrick's Inn. The staff at the tavern hear disembodied footsteps, coughing, and voices, and feel an eerie sensation in the old stairwells and hallways. Witnesses have seen the front doors swing open on their own, and some people claim the ghost of Edgar Allan Poe himself haunts the building. Staff have also reported bar stools dragging themselves across the floor and falling over on their own, and items behind the bar get rearranged when no one is there to relocate them. I just do want to point out that in the Horseshoe Came In On Saloon in Baltimore, bar stools are also pulled out from underneath people, if those people want to deny the existence of ghosts. Perhaps that's a thing that Edgar Allan Poe likes to do. There's also the ghost of an outlaw who was gunned down in the street outside the former inn, and an elderly woman who frequently stayed there. So the inn has a couple of ghosts: Poe, the outlaw, and the elderly woman. There's also a quick mention of a Poe haunting in the town of Providence, Rhode Island. In the library where Poe courted and was later dumped by Sarah Helen Whitman, his ghost is supposedly still lingering. Poe died not long after he was dumped by Whitman, and it's said that Whitman summoned his spirit there. Decades later, a man was found sleeping on the steps of the library, and when he was asked to leave, he yelled, The Conqueror Worm, which was a title of one of Poe's poems, and then he just vanished into thin air. You recall that Poe lived in Philadelphia for a time, so now we're in Pennsylvania, in case you're wondering. We were in Virginia, then we were in Baltimore, then we were in, South Carolina, then we went to Delaware, now we're in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. No, we were in Delaware, then we were in Rhode Island, and now we're in Pennsylvania. The Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site was Poe's residence in 1843. Both The Telltale Heart and The Murders in the Rue Morgue were written here, and the house was also the setting for The Black Cat. Edgar Allan Poe's ghost is seen walking along the Schuylkill River banks near the Fairmont Waterworks and near his former home. Park rangers have reported some visitors who go down into the basement of the home claim to see glowing cat eyes staring at them, and others say it just feels eerie overall. And last but not least, we're going to head to the state of New York. So we have Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, Delaware, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and now New York. That's 7 states, ladies and gentlemen, that this poet haunts. One of the homes he lived in was demolished by New York University to make room for Furman Hall. They kept the original facade and banister of Poe's home. Students in Furman Hall have reported seeing the figure of a man standing near the banister that strongly resembles Poe. Poe also lived in the second floor of 47 Bond Street and enjoyed visiting the bar that used to be below it. Today, staff of the restaurant there find bottles of wine opened and wine missing from bottles, though no one was in the building. They know Poe's ghost has paid them a visit. Sometimes if you look in the window, you can see him sitting there and writing. In the cottage in the Bronx where Poe lived with his aunt and wife, and where his wife died, there's a rocking chair and a mirror belonging to the Poes, along with Virginia Poe's deathbed. The rocking chair sometimes rocks on its own, and the mirror has an eerie feeling about it. There's actually a photo somewhere of what looks like a face in the mirror. It shouldn't be too surprising that Edgar Allan Poe's ghost haunts so many places. He had a short, sad, and tragic life, though he was an incredibly talented writer and highly intelligent. So that's going to do it for this episode of Lurk. I hope you enjoyed this little story about the life and times of Edgar Allan Poe and some stories from his afterlife. As always, you can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcast or at lurkpodcast.com. There you can find the links to our social media accounts. We can be found on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We suggest following us on one or all of these. We also have a Facebook group, and we would love for you to join the discussions. We also have merch. You can find that at lurkpodcastmerch.com. We have all kinds of items available there. If you have any suggestions for any upcoming show topics, drop us a line at lurkpodcast@yahoo.com or via direct message in one of our social media apps. I'm always looking for new and little-known paranormal topics from the United States or abroad. I do know that we have some listeners in Europe, Australia, South America. I think there's one in Africa. But please, send me your suggestions. So, until next time, keep lurking.
Say nevermore. Say nevermore.